She was just a maid, until she found a baby crying alone by the fire and a hidden will naming her as his guardian. But when the billionaire walked in and saw her holding both, he didn't ask questions. He whispered, "You were never supposed to know." What secret was he trying to bury? With love? Before we dive into this unforgettable journey, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? If stories about love, sacrifice, and second chances speak to your heart, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we're bringing you another powerful story you won't want to miss. Rain lashed against the windows of Thorne Estate as Lucia Alvarez moved swiftly through the marble corridors, her soaked shoes leaving faint prints on the gleaming floors. The storm outside echoed her urgency. Her daughter had a fever and she'd promised her neighbors she'd be home by 8, but the master had called for an early polish in the great room, and Lucia, ever obedient, couldn't say no. She adjusted her cleaning apron and picked up the brass polish, but a sound, faint, brittle, and unfamiliar, made her freeze mid-step. Crying. It wasn't the wail of a servant's child, nor the sharp murmur of a cat. It was soft, muffled, like the sound of a baby trying not to be heard. Her heart thudded. Everyone knew the West Wing was off limits. Mr. Thorne had ordered it sealed since his wife's accident. No lights, no staff, no mention. But the sound tugged at something deeper in Lucia. Against instinct and instruction, she turned toward the dark hallway, where dust had settled on furniture like a second skin. The door at the end was ajar, and from it came the gentle sob. She pushed it open. A single fireplace flickered weakly on the far wall. The room was cavernous, the air heavy with forgotten perfume and grief. On a velvet rug, nestled between tipped-over picture frames and an abandoned toy, sat a baby boy, barely a year old, wrapped in a silk blanket, cheeks flushed and eyes red from crying. Lucia didn't think. She dropped to her knees and scooped him into her arms. It's all right, she whispered, in Spanish, brushing his damp curls from his forehead. You're safe now. He clung to her blouse with trembling fingers, and Lucia's throat tightened. The boy was warm, frightened, alone. The soft creak of a floorboard behind her made her jump. Put him down, came a voice, deep and strained. Lucia turned slowly. Graham Thorne stood at the threshold, his frame tall, soaked from the storm, a glass of brandy forgotten in one hand. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, they betrayed something. Not rage, not accusation, but something raw. I heard him crying, Lucia stammered, still holding the boy close. There was no one, he was just alone. Graham's gaze locked on the baby, his hand clenched around the brandy. Put him down, he repeated, but softer now. Lucia slowly lowered the child, who whimpered but did not resist. Graham stepped forward and lifted his son into his arms. The boy immediately buried his face in his father's collarbone, whimpering something unintelligible. Graham stood frozen, unsure what to do with this closeness. Then he simply nodded at Lucia and turned to leave. Sure, she said before he could vanish into the shadow of the hall. Where is his mother? He paused. Rain cracked like glass against the tall windows. It's gone, he said. And then he was gone too. Lucia stood in the silence of the abandoned nursery, her arms still warm where the child had rested. She stared at the toys covered in dust, the empty crib, the untouched bottle on the dresser. She felt cold. That night, back in her small shared servant quarters, Lucia couldn't sleep. She lay awake, listening to the storm, replaying the boy's face in her mind. His quiet desperation, the way he reached for her without knowing her name. Just before dawn, the cook crept in with a steaming cup of tea and sat beside her. You saw the boy? The older woman asked. Lucia nodded. He was alone. The cook sighed, staring out the window. She died a month ago. Complications. He never told anyone. No funeral, no family visits, nothing. Locked that part of the house and buried the rest. Lucia whispered, almost to herself, why would a man hide his own grief? The cook touched her shoulder. Because sometimes grief doesn't want to be seen, especially not by the people who still live. The next morning, Lucia arrived early for her shift. but her steps felt heavier. The storm had passed, leaving behind damp stone paths and the scent of pine and sorrow in the air. She made her way through the estate with the usual purpose, but her mind kept circling back to the little boy's eyes, dark, wide, and searching. When she entered the kitchen, the cook handed her a tray of fruit and tea. "Take this up to the west wing," she said quietly, her eyes avoiding Lucia's. "He asked for it." Lucia froze. "Mr. Thorne?" The cook only nodded. Heart pounding, Lucia walked the long hallway once again, this time with permission. The nursery door was ajar, sunlight streaming faintly across the carpet. Graham sat in a leather chair, still in his wrinkled shirt from the night before. The baby, Thomas, she later learned was in his arms, sleepy-eyed but calm. Lucia set the tray down carefully. "You came back," Graham said without looking up. "You asked me to," she replied, unsure what tone to use. "I didn't mean to frighten you," he said after a pause. "He just doesn't cry for anyone else." Lucia hesitated, unsure if it was a compliment or a burden. "He was alone," she said, her voice steady. "He shouldn't be." Graham looked up at her then, his face pale and hollow. Neither should she have been. There was a heaviness in the room, not just grief, but guilt. Lucia cleared her throat. "May I ask what happened?" His jaw tightened. "She wasn't well after the birth, and I was busy with the estate, with investors, with everything but her." Lucia's voice softened. "She died here." Room. Silence settled, thick and uncomfortable. Thomas stirred in his arms. "Wanted to name him Elias," Graham said quietly, "but my mother insisted on Thomas." Tradition. Lucy couldn't help herself. What did she want for him? Graham looked out the window. She wanted him to feel loved. Lucia nodded, her hands clasped in front of her apron. Then perhaps he should see people who make him feel that. He studied her a moment. "You're very direct." "I'm very tired, sir," she said, and almost smiled. "And so is he." He stood, rocked the baby gently, and for the first time asked, "Will you stay? Just a while." Lucia blinked. "You want me to?" "Sit with him, until he sleeps. You have a calming presence." She moved slowly toward the rocking chair and took the baby, who settled in her arms like he belonged there. Graham watched silently, then turned and walked to the window, his silhouette framed in gold morning light. As Thomas drifted off, Lucia glanced at the faded picture on the mantel. A woman, vibrant and full of life, cradling the newborn. Her eyes were kind, the same kind of softness she saw trying to surface in Graham, but buried under layers of restraint and loss. After Thomas was asleep, Lucia gently placed him in his crib. She rose to leave but paused near the door. "He should talk about her," she said softly. Graham didn't turn around. "I forgot how." Lucia didn't reply. Some wounds weren't meant to be dressed in a single day. Back in the kitchen, the cook was washing herbs. She looked up and Lucia simply nodded. That night, Lucia dreamed of velvet rugs, of a crying child soothed by rain, and of a man staring through glass with eyes full of things left unsaid. And when she woke, she knew one thing for certain. She was already far more entangled in the Thorne estate than she'd ever intended. Lucia didn't ask for the reassignment. It came the next morning in a folded note slipped beneath her breakfast tray. Effective immediately, it read. Nursey duty. No signature, but she didn't need one. The cook raised an eyebrow as she tied her apron. "Guess someone noticed," she said with a knowing glance. Lucia made her way to the nursery with steady steps. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old books, sunlight creeping through the sheer curtains. Elias was already awake in his crib, wide-eyed and fussing. "Good morning, sweetheart," she whispered, lifting him gently. He calmed the instant her arms wrapped around him. So they settled into a rhythm. Feedings, lullabies, tiny socks that never stayed on. Lucia began to understand his cries, his preferences. He hated pears, loved the warmth of her shawl, and fell asleep fastest to the same hum she used to comfort her younger siblings. One morning, while reorganizing a shelf, she found a small wooden music box tucked behind a stack of dusty linen books. She opened it. A soft melody spilled out, delicate, haunting. Inside the lid, in elegant script, was the name Charlotte. Lucia froze. Later that day, she asked the cook, casually, "Who's Charlotte?" The cook paused, glanced around, then leaned closer. Not his wife, his mistress. She died, suddenly. Complications, they said. And then silent. A funeral. No mention, just gone. Lucia felt something shift inside her. Grief hidden is grief doubled. That evening, she sang Elias to sleep. Graham stood in the hallway outside, his figure reflected in the glass pane. She could feel his presence before she saw it. When she emerged from the nursery, he was waiting. "He likes when you hum that one," he said quietly. Lucia hesitated. "It's just a tune my mother used." She used to sing it too. His voice cracked, barely. "Charlotte?" Lucy didn't know what to say. He turned away before she had to. Over the next few days, Graham became more present. He never stepped inside the nursery, but he left notes, specific instructions, almost obsessively detailed. "He's the blue blanket. He sleeps better with it. Don't forget the moon lamp. It keeps the shadows away." To under his chin twice. "He drools when dreaming." Lucia followed them, of course, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't about Elias. It was about control, or perhaps penance. Then, one evening, while dusting the wrong hallway, she wasn't even supposed to be there, she opened a door to what she thought was the linen room. Instead, she found an office. Not Graham's usual study. This one was smaller, dimmer, the fireplace cold. A single desk sat beneath an oil painting of the estate, papers scattered across its surface. She stepped inside cautiously, and there, on the desk, was a manila envelope. Well. Her breath caught. She didn't mean to read it, but her eyes landed on the lines before she could stop them. "In the event of my death, I leave the Thorne estate in trust to my son, Elias Grayson Thorne." Her hands trembled. Then another clause. "Should circumstances render me unable to fulfill my parental duties, guardianship shall be granted to Lucia." Her name, written in ink, sharp, unmistakable. She stepped back like the paper had burned her. Just then, the door clicked shut. Graham stood behind it. He didn't look surprised. "How much did you read?" he asked calmly, his voice too even. Lucia tried to speak, but only managed, "Nah, enough." He nodded, slowly. Lucia's hands were still trembling, the world's words echoing in her head. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you choose me?" Graham moved toward the desk but didn't sit. He stared at the papers like they were ghosts. "Because you didn't run," he said, "because you saw him and didn't see an inconvenience. You saw a child, a soul." Lucia crossed her arms over her chest, as if trying to guard her racing heart. "That's not a reason to hand over a legacy." His mouth tightened. "You think I care about the legacy? I'd burn it all down if it meant he'd be safe. But the world we're in, the name he carries, it attracts vultures." She looked up at him, searching for the man beneath the frost. "Then why not your lawyers, a godparent, a relative?" "I don't trust them," he said plainly. "But I trust the way he looks at you, the way you hold him like he matters." Lucia turned toward the window. The rain had stopped. Only the hush of wind filled the silence between them. "I didn't ask for this," she said. "No. I'm not qualified for this kind of life." "Neither am I," he replied. They stood there for a moment, suspended in that quiet honesty. Then Graham spoke again, softer this time. "She wanted someone kind to raise him if I couldn't. Charlotte, she told me once, love isn't about grand gestures, it's who stays when the fire's out." Lucia closed her eyes, feeling her chest tighten. Is this your way of stepping out?" she asked carefully. "Now here is something to admire," he answered without hesitation. It's my way of preparing for anything. The next morning, the nursery felt different. Elias cooed as she dressed him, grasping at her braid with clumsy fingers. His laugh, small and gurgled, wrapped itself around her heart. Later, Graham entered without knocking. He looked differentless, guarded, maybe even unsure. "I have meetings," he said, glancing toward Elias. "But I wanted to leave something." He handed Lucia a small velvet pouch. She opened it to find a pendant. Inside was a miniature photograph shown holding Elias. Behind it, a note in delicate handwriting. "Thank you for hearing his cry." Lucia touched the pendant as if it might vanish. "This was hers?" He nodded. "She asked me to give it, if I ever found someone worthy." Tears welled unexpectedly in her eyes. She blinked them away quickly. That evening, she sat by the nursery window, after Elias had fallen asleep. The moonlight touched the corners of the room, silvering the shadows. She turned the music box once more. The melody played gently, Charlotte's melody. Graham hadn't appeared that night, but his presence lingered. In the scent of the chair cushion, in the blanket he had chosen, in the name she couldn't stop seeing on that wall. She pulled the document from her apron pocket again. Her name, scrawled in ink, stared back at her. It terrified her. And yet, it felt like something else, too. Like purpose. When the house had gone still, she stepped out into the corridor. Light spilled from the far end of the study. He approached quietly, pausing at the doorway. Graham sat with his head in his hands, the fire before him casting flickers of gold across his tired face. Lucia spoke softly. "If you're asking me to stay, or him, I will." He lifted his head slowly, pointedly asking. "Then ask Goldarelli to stay, for you," she added, heart racing. "Then I need to know the truth of what's behind all this. All of it." Graham met her eyes, steady now. "Then stay, and I'll show you." Graham stood in the doorway, holding something in his hand, a photograph. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was low and steady. "Who are you really, Lucia?" She blinked. "What?" He walked closer, holding out the photograph between two fingers. The edges were worn, the colors faded, but the image was clear. Charlotte sat on a bench beneath a tree, holding baby Elias in her arms. Her face was tired, but glowing. Beside her, barely in frame, stood a teenage girl with a long braid and a ribbon in her hair. She was smiling, unaware that the camera had caught her. Lucia stared at it, stunned. Her throat tightened. "I found this in one of Charlotte's journals," Graham said, "buried in a book she used to hide from me." Lucia took the photo from his hand. Her fingers shook. "You were there that night," he said quietly. "The night Elias was born." She nodded slowly. "Yes, I was." Silence stretched between them. The fire crackled in the nearby hearth, but it did nothing to ease the chill in her chest. "I was just a foster kid," she began. "Same house, same system. Charlotte was older, but she took care of me like a big sister. She called me Sunflower, said I was the only bright spot in a place full of shadows." Graham didn't interrupt. He waited. Lucia lowered the photograph. Her eyes glistened. "When she met you, she thought she finally had something that belonged only to her. But your world wasn't safe, Graham. She knew it. She never wanted it to touch Elias." He exhaled, "And yet she never told me." "She wanted to, I think. But that night, she wasn't well. I was in the room when she had the seizure. The ambulance came too late. Before she slipped away, she grabbed my hand and said 3 words. She looked up at him, her voice breaking. "Protect my son." Graham stepped back like the air had been knocked from him. "She said that to you?" Lucia nodded. "I didn't even understand what it meant until weeks later. But when I saw Elias again, crying alone in that room, I knew." Graham looked away, gripping the back of a chair. "Why didn't you say anything? You were grieving, broken, cold. You didn't even acknowledge the staff for months. I thought if I spoke up, you'd fire me, or worse." He turned back to her, eyes dark. "You think I'd cast you out for protecting him?" "I don't know what kind of man you are," she said honestly, "but I do know what kind of world this is." He studied her for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression. "I read the will again," he said. "The real one, not the draft." Luca stiffened. "It names Elias as sole heir. But if anything happens to me, there's a clause. The board must approve guardianship, and my brother sits on that board." Lucia stepped forward. "He's already watching. I've seen him, near the gardens, his driver snooping in the courtyard." Graham's face hardened. "He'll never get his hands on Elias." "Then you need to make the guardianship binding. Public. Now." He looked at her, the fire casting golden light across his cheekbones. "Then I need you," he said. "Not as a maid, not anymore." Lucia's heart skipped. "What are you asking?" she whispered. He took a breath. "I'm asking you to step into the light, Lucia. To stand beside me, not behind. If you loved Charlotte, if you love him, help me protect what's left of her." Lucia's eyes welled with tears. "You're trusting me with everything?" "I already did," he said, "the night I let you hold him." Lucia stood frozen in the center of the room, Graham's words still echoing in her ears. "The night I let you hold him." She remembered the way Elias's tiny body had curled against her chest, how his cries had softened under her humming. That moment hadn't been permission, it had been instinct. And now she knew it had meant everything. She sat down slowly on the edge of the couch, holding the photo in both hands. "I never wanted this to be a secret," she said, "but Charlotte always made me promise never let anyone know we were close. She didn't want your world to swallow me too." Graham knelt beside her. "You've already seen more than most people ever could. You stayed. That says enough." Lucia looked at him, unsure. "But if your brother finds out that I was involved in Charlotte's life, that she asked me to protect Elias, he could twist it, say I'm manipulating you." Graham's expression darkened. "Let him try." She studied his face for a long moment. "You didn't mourn her properly." His jaw clenched. "I couldn't. My father controlled every appearance I made, every word. He didn't approve of her. He made me pretend it was just a passing phase, but it wasn't." He walked over to the cabinet and pulled out an old wooden box. Inside, wrapped in silk, was a silver bracelet engraved with the initials CE and the date Elias was born. "Teeth was hers," he said. "I kept it, even when they told me to bury everything." Lucia's voice dropped. "Then why didn't you keep her memory alive?" He met her eyes. "Because I thought I'd lost the only person who could tell his story. Until I saw you with him." There was a beat of silence. Lucia looked down at the bracelet. "Do you think he'll ever remember her?" Graham slowly shook his head. "Maybe not with his mind, but with his heart? Every time you sing to him, every time he reaches for you before anyone else, that's her coming through." Lucia wiped her eyes. "You can't protect him from everything, Graham, but you can make sure the right people are standing between him and the world." Graham walked toward the fireplace, staring into the flames. "And if that means giving up control?" Lucia said gently, "Then give it up. For him." He turned to face her. "Then we begin tomorrow. I'll call my lawyer, make your role official." She stood. "I never asked for this." "I know," he said. "That's why you're the only one I can trust." At the doorway, Elias's soft cries echoed through the corridor. Lucy instinctively moved, but Graham stopped her with a hand on her arm. "Wait," he said. "Let me try." Lucas nodded and watched as he disappeared down the hall. Moments later, the cries faded. Graham returned, carrying Elias, the baby's tiny fingers curled into his father's collar. For the first time, Elias didn't cry when Graham held him. Lucia reached out to adjust the baby's blanket. "He knows you," she whispered. Graham looked at her. "He knows you too, and soon, the world will." That night, Lucia sat by the nursery window, watching the rain streak down the glass. Below, the estate grounds shimmered in the mist, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like a maid watching someone else's life. She felt like part of it. In the cradle, Elias stirred and cooed. Lucia leaned over him, brushing a hand over his dark curls. "Your mother loved you, little one," she whispered. "And now, two people do." From the hallway, Graham's silhouette lingered in the doorway, listening. Tomorrow would bring threats, decisions, and risks, but for now, the house was quiet. And for the first time in months, it felt like a home again. The first sign was subtle. A bottle shattered near the crib, glass everywhere. Lucia had just stepped out for a minute to grab a fresh blanket, but when she returned, the scent of broken milk and sharp shards glinted under the moonlight. At first, she blamed herself. Maybe she had placed it too close to the edge. But the next day, it happened again. This time, it was one of the wheels on Elias's crib. It had been unscrewed, but enough that if she hadn't caught the wobble when she rocked him to sleep, the entire cradle could have tipped. Her hands trembled as she tightened it with a wrench, her breath short in her chest. Lucia told Graham in hushed tones. His face went stone cold. He wasted no time. That evening, he summoned his brother, Vincent, to his study. Lucius stayed just outside the door, pretending to dust the hallway shelves, but every word pierced through the wood like shards. "You think I don't see what you're doing?" Graham's voice was low, barely controlled. Vinton laughed, smooth and bitter. "What I think is that you've lost your mind, hiding away in this mausoleum, playing house with some servant, and claiming a child who will never belong." Lucia's fingers tightened on the duster. "Elias is my son," Graham said sharply. "No," Vincent sneered. "He's your mistake, and you think you can rewrite the Thorne legacy around a bastard?" "Around her?" A pause, then colder. "The board will never accept it, but don't worry, I'll fix it." And the most... Lucia turned away, heart racing. She had to know more. That night, when the estate was dark and the halls silent, she crept down into the family archives. The door creaked, but no one stirred. Inside, under piles of dust and forgotten documents, she found it. A second will. She unrolled it slowly under the light of a flickering candle. Her heart nearly stopped. It was signed, sealed, and it left the entire Thorne estate, including the trust tied to Elias, to Vincent. But the signatures weren't right. They looked practiced, traced, almost too perfect. Lucia remembered Charlotte's handwriting, how it curled slightly at the end. This one didn't. Her hands shaking, she took the will straight to Graham. He read it in silence, jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might break. When he finally spoke, it was a whisper. "He's planning to submit this when I'm dead." Lucia stared at him. "You don't think he..." "I didn't until now." That night, as Graham prepared to leave for a rare meeting in town, Lucia kissed Elias on the forehead and handed him over. But something gnawed at her, a feeling in her stomach she couldn't shake. When Graham reached for his keys, Lucia stopped him. "Take my car instead." He looked at her, puzzled. She didn't explain, she just pressed the keys into his palm. The next morning, the housekeeper's scream echoed through the halls. Lucia ran to the front drive. Her own car, the one Graham hadn't taken, sat with brake fluid leaking onto the stones. The lines had been slashed. Graham pulled her aside into the nursery, his arms tight around her shoulders. "From now on, you stay in this house. Don't leave his side, not for anything." Lucia looked down at Elias, sleeping peacefully in his crib. "I won't," she said. "Neither of us will." The morning after the brake line incident, the estate felt heavier. Even the sun filtering through the nursery curtains seemed dulled. Lucy moved through the mansion like a shadow, never straying far from Elias. She kept a baby monitor in her pocket, a kitchen knife tucked into the folds of her apron, not out of fear, but out of quiet resolve. Elias had started teething again. His whimpers broke the silence often, but she welcomed the distraction. Each cry was proof he was alive, breathing, still hers to protect. She sang lullabies softly, the ones Charlotte used to hum when they were girls, safe in that foster home before the world fractured around them. Later that afternoon, Graham called an emergency meeting with his lawyers. He wanted a new will drafted, airtight, and witnessed properly. This time, Elias would be protected, and Lucia's role would be clear, no longer left to implication or outdated drafts. "I won't wait for Vincent to act," Graham said. "We act first." Lucia sat quietly in the corner as they discussed clauses, contingencies, trusts. It was strange hearing her name spoken in legal terms, but Graham never flinched. Every word he spoke with certainty. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly when the lawyers left. "You could just disappear, start over somewhere else." He looked at her then, truly looked. His eyes weren't cold the way they had been when they first met. They were tired, determined. "This is our home now. Elias deserves roots. And Charlotte, she trusted you. That means everything." Lucia wanted to believe that would be enough, but by sunset another message arrived. A single white envelope was found wedged under the nursery door. Inside was a photo taken from the hedge line. It showed Lucia holding Elias, his cheek pressed to her collarbone, her eyes closed in comfort. There was no note, just that image. The meaning was clear. "We see you." She didn't tell Graham immediately. Instead, she put the photo in the fire and watched it curl into ash. But she kept the ashes in a jar, sealed tight. A reminder that threats could burn too. That night, as thunder rolled in the distance, Graham stayed in the nursery. He pulled a cot near the crib and sat with a book in hand, pretending to read, but watching every shadow. Lucia sat across the room, arms crossed, her gaze on the door. Elias stirred, whimpered, then drifted back to sleep. In the hush that followed, Graham finally spoke. "I was going to marry Charlotte. She didn't want the title, didn't care for the name Thorne, but she wanted Elias to have a chance." Lucy turned her head. "Then why hide him?" "Because I was afraid that he'd be used, that I'd fail him the same way I failed her." Lucia stood, walked to the crib, and gently adjusted the blanket around Elias. "You're not failing him," she said, "but if we don't act soon, someone else will." Graham rose and walked to her side. "Then we fight. Together." Lucia nodded slowly. Storm outside cracked louder, like a warning. Beneath the nursery, beneath the watchful moon lamp and a sleeping child, two protectors stood as one. The grand ballroom, once dormant and dust-veiled, was alive with candlelight and muted strings as guests filtered through the carved mahogany doors. For the first time in years, the Thorne estate hosted a private gathering, discreet, curated, and intentional. The whispers in society had grown louder since Charlotte's mysterious death, and Graham needed to reclaim the narrative. This evening wasn't just about appearances, it was about rewriting legacy. Lucia stood at the far end of the hall, her breath caught in her chest. The dress clung too perfectly, a deep sapphire blue that shimmered beneath the chandelier. Her curls were swept gently to one side, and for a moment, she didn't feel like the maid or the orphan. She felt seen. But being seen came with stares. She caught murmurs from the staff, subtle glances from guests. "Is that the maid?" someone whispered near the dessert table. "Thorne's gone mad?" She focused on him a little, knelt in a cushioned pram by the musicians, giggling as he tugged at a violinist's sleeve. He didn't care about the whispers. To him, she was simply the one who sang him lullabies, who held him when storms rolled through the night. Graham approached her near the terrace entrance. "You look remarkable." Lucas smiled faintly. "I feel like I borrowed someone else's life." He offered his arm. "Borrow it a bit longer, at least through one dance." Reluctantly, she placed her hand in his. The music shifted into something slower, more deliberate. As they stepped onto the floor, conversations faltered. Guests turned to watch. The usually stoic Graham Thorne glided across the marble tiles, not with a polished socialite, but with a woman many still mistook for hired help. Halfway through the waltz, the doors slammed open. Vincent Thorne entered in a tailored gray suit and a storm brewing in his eyes. "Lovely soiree, brother," he called out. "Very modern." The room stiffened. Graham's hand tightened around Lucia's waist. Vincent sauntered in, glass already in hand. "I see you've moved on from hiding the boy to parading him." Lucia stepped back instinctively. Graham shielded her slightly, but Vincent was already circling. "I wonder, Graham," Vincent said, swirling his drink. "Did you vet her properly? Do the guests know? She was in foster care, wasn't she? A runaway, undemanded, no formal record until she landed here. Lucia's heart pounded. Every word chipped at the fragile shell she'd built since childhood. She's not who you think, Vincent sneered. Graham stepped forward. Enough. But the damage was done. The crowd had already begun murmuring again, this time with a sharper edge. Lucia turned. The chandelier lights blurred as her vision stung. She pushed through the crowd, out onto the terrace, down the garden steps. The night air hit her like a wave, cold and laced with memory. She stopped near the rose trellis, clinging to the vine-covered railing. Footsteps approached. I shouldn't have come, she whispered. This wasn't my place. Graham's voice was low behind her. It's exactly your place. She turned. You heard what he said. I heard a bitter man, and I saw a room full of people who don't understand you. Lucia blinked rapidly. That's the story of my life. Not belonging, always on the edge of someone else's world. Graham stepped closer, brushing a stray hair from her cheek. You don't belong on the edge, Lucia. You belong in the center. Here. With us. He leaned in, hesitant, giving her the choice. Her breath hitched. From the hallway window, a soft laugh echoed Elias, watching them, his small hands pressed to the glass, moonlight in his curls. Lucia's eyes welled up. He deserves better than all of this. Graham smiled. He has you, and if I'm lucky, he'll have me too. Then, slowly, he kissed her, soft, patient, a question more than an answer. Elias giggled again, as if giving his approval. Lucia stood there stunned, her lips still tingling from the kiss, her heart pounding against her ribs like a drum. She wasn't supposed to be here, not like this, not in a gown, not being kissed under the moonlight by a man who once terrified her with silence. And yet, in that moment, it all felt right. Graham pulled back, searching her eyes, not for permission, but for truth. I know I've failed in more ways than I can count, but I see you, Lucia. Not as a servant, not as a ghost from Charlotte's past. I see you for who you are now. She trembled. And who's that? He gave a soft breath. The woman I trust with my son's life. The woman I can't seem to forget. The woman who walked into a storm and brought calm. Lucia turned her face away, ashamed of the heat rushing to her cheeks. But what if he's right, Graham? What if I don't belong in this world? What if everything Vincent said? Then let them say it, Graham interrupted. Let them whisper, let them wonder. I don't care what rooms I'm invited into anymore. I care about who's waiting for me when I leave them. Lucia blinked hard, trying to keep the tears from falling. He continued, voice low and steady. I've lived most of my life behind locked doors, keeping the world out. But the moment you walked into that nursery, the locks didn't work anymore. They stood in silence, wrapped in the scent of damp earth and roses, until a soft voice startled them. I dropped Mr. Bunny, Elias said from the garden steps, holding one shoe in his hand and looking very proud of himself for escaping the pram. Lucia laughed, a true, full laugh. She bent down and scooped him up. You little explorer. Graham ruffled his son's curls. How about we go find him together? Elias nodded vigorously, and Lucia felt something shift inside her. A peace. A beginning. The next morning, whispers spread beyond the estate. Vincent had returned to the city, livid. Rumors swirled of arguments, threats of legal action, private investigators. But none of that mattered, at least not that day. Lucia returned to the staff quarters briefly to change. When she entered the nursery again, she found a note on the table. In Graham's unmistakable handwriting it read, If you still feel like you don't belong here, I'll keep building a home around you until you do. It was signed simply, G. Later that week, Graham made a quiet announcement, one that stunned even his most loyal inner circle. He was formally introducing Elias Thorne as his son and heir, and the boy's official guardian was listed as Lucia Alvarez. The press wasn't invited. There were no public statements, only a private signing in the library with witnesses. Afterward, Graham walked out to the garden and found Lucia pacing nervously, Elias asleep in her arms. It's done, he said softly. Lucia looked up. So what now? Graham shrugged. We live, we build, we protect what matters. She nodded slowly. And if Vincent comes for us? Then he'll find out exactly how far I'm willing to go for the two people who saved my life. Lucia didn't reply. Instead, she leaned her head against his shoulder, the warm weight of Elias cradled between them. The sun filtered through the trees, casting doubt on everything it touched. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like a maid or a foster kid or a burden. She felt like a choice. Lucia stood in the quiet of the nursery, the lamp casting a warm glow across the wooden floor. The hush of midnight settled around her as she carefully unfolded the will once more. The original document, ink still vivid, untouched by the manipulation Vincent had attempted. Her fingers trembled as she ran them over Graham's name beside Elias's, her own name carefully typed under the guardianship clause. She turned as Graham entered, his expression torn between worry and weariness. "You found it again," he said softly, crossing to her side. Lucio nodded. "It's the only thing standing between Elias and your brother's greed." Graham exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "If I sign this, I name you as his guardian. If anything happens to me..." "I know." Lucia looked at him, her eyes steady. "But that's the point. If anything does happen, he needs someone who will protect him, not inherit him." He hesitated, staring at the document. "Vincent won't stop. If he sees your name, you'll be next." "I'm already in danger just by being here," she replied. "But I'm not afraid. Not if it means Elias is safe." Graham lowered his gaze, then walked to the nursery desk and picked up a pen. He paused for a moment, the weight of the decision evident in the tension across his shoulders. Then he signed. Lucia exhaled slowly. They both stared at the paper for a long moment before Graham quietly folded it again and walked to the far wall. He pulled a section of wood paneling aside, revealing a narrow compartment embedded in the wall behind a false bookshelf. Gently, he slid the will inside. "No one will find it here," he murmured. Later that night, the rain returned, tapping against the windows like an impatient hand. Lucia couldn't sleep. Something in the air felt off, as if the wind itself carried a warning. She wandered the halls in her slippers, checking each window and door out of instinct. The house was dark, silent, until she passed the nursery. A sound, soft, subtle, a creak. She froze. Slowly, she crept toward the door. It was slightly ajar. Her breath caught. Through the crack, she saw a figure crouching at the nursery window, gloved hands working at the latch. Her heart leapt. "Stop!" she shouted, flinging the door open. The intruder turned. Before she could scream again, Graham appeared from the hallway in a blur. He tackled his brother to the ground with a force born not of fury, but of pure instinct. The two men struggled on the carpet, Vincent snarling curses as Graham pinned him. Lucia ran to Elias, scooping the baby from his crib and clutching him tightly. He whimpered, but didn't cry. Moments later, the guards arrived, alerted by the commotion. They wrestled Vincent to his feet. Rain plastered his dark hair to his face as they dragged him down the hallway. "You think you're noble now, brother," Vincent shouted. "Letting a maid run your house? She's not who she says she is." The words sliced through the quiet like broken glass. Girl glanced at Lucia, his eyes shadowed but calm. "Then tell me who you really are." Lucia held Elias close. Her past, the parts she had spent years burying, hovered like ghosts in the room. And yet, she did not flinch. She looked at Graham and whispered, "I will." Lucia's hands trembled slightly as she cradled Elias against her chest. The baby had fallen asleep, again, unaware of the storm his world had just passed through. Graham watched her in silence, waiting, not with suspicion, but with a solemn sort of patience. They returned to the sitting room, away from the nursery. The fire had burned low. Lucia placed Elias gently in a cushioned chair nearby, tucking a blanket around him before she turned to face Graham. "My name isn't on any records," she began. "Not the way you'd expect. When I was 9, I was placed under a different surname, Margos. Before that, I was simply Lucia Alvarez, daughter of no one." The foster system erased everything else. Graham nodded, not interrupting. His expression had softened, but a guarded curiosity still lingered behind his eyes. Charlotte's mother took me in briefly, Lucia continued. It was the first place I felt safe. Charlotte treated me like a little sister. She gave me her old hair ribbons, taught me to braid. She even used to say if anything happened, I should protect what mattered most. Graham leaned forward. And she told you that? Before she died? Lucia nodded. The day she collapsed, she had a seizure. The ambulance took too long. I was with her. She grabbed my hand and whispered, "Protect my son. Don't trust them." She never said names, but later when I learned about you, I knew. Graham closed his eyes for a moment. She knew my family wouldn't accept him. She didn't just fear rejection, she feared sabotage. Lucia's voice shook, but she pressed on. I kept her words with me all these years. When I came to this estate as a maid, I didn't recognize Elias at first. But when I saw the photo, I knew. I didn't say anything because who would believe a maid with no papers and a foster record? Graham stood, his face unreadable as he walked toward the window Vincent had tried to climb through. He stared out at the storm still unraveling over the hills. "I believe you," he said quietly. Lucia blinked. "You do?" "I've been lied to my entire life," he said. "By my father, my brother, but never by you. Not once." There was a silence between them, thick but not painful. Lucia stepped forward. "You asked who I really am. I'm not someone with a title or legacy. I'm just a girl who lost too much too early, who never stopped carrying a promise." Graham turned to her, eyes steady. "Then you're the only person I trust to carry mine." They moved back to the nursery together, where Elias still slept peacefully. Graham reached for Lucia's hand and held it, firm and sure. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." She gave the faintest nod. As dawn neared, the storm faded. The rain slowed, leaving streaks across the glass. Graham made coffee while Lucia rocked Elias gently by the window. There was no more need for shadows or secrets. They had chosen each other in the firelight through the storm, and now in the calm. Lucia stood at the edge of Graham's study, her hands trembling slightly as she held the envelope. The room was quiet except for the steady tick of the grandfather clock. Graham looked up from his desk, sensing something different in her posture. "I want to show you something," Lucia said, her voice soft but clear. She stepped forward and handed him the envelope. Inside was a single sheet, her birth certificate. Graham unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning the name printed in elegant type. His breath caught. Simple. Lucia, Charlotte Reyes. His gaze lifted to hers. "She raised me," Lucia said, her voice tight with emotion. Charlotte. She wasn't just a friend or a caretaker, she was family. She named me after herself. After my mother left and the system didn't know what to do with me, Charlotte took me in. Graham sat back, the weight of her revelation washing over him. "All this time, you were never just the maid." "I never meant to lie," she whispered, "but I couldn't lead with a name that no longer protected me." He stood, slowly. "You carried her name all this time, while I was too broken to say it out loud." Lucia's eyes shimmered with tears. "I kept her close, even after she was gone." The moment wrapped around them like a hush, a shared thread of grief and gratitude for the woman they both loved. Later that afternoon, the estate's lawyer arrived with official documents in hand. The forged will Vincent had tried to submit had been reviewed. The signatures were confirmed as fraudulent. Charges would be filed immediately. "He won't be getting out anytime soon," the lawyer said before leaving, "and the estate is safe for now." Lucia stood near the nursery doorway as Graham leaned against the wall, his shoulders slack with relief. "It's over," he said, more to himself than to her. Lucia nodded but said nothing. She turned to look into the nursery. Elias was sitting up in his crib, wide-eyed and giggling at his own reflection in the mirror toy. When she stepped inside, he reached for her instinctively. She lifted him into her arms, swaying softly, humming the lullaby Charlotte had taught her. As she cradled him, Elias pressed his face into her shoulder, then pulled back, touched her nose and said softly, "Mama?" Lucia froze. The world spun slower. She stared at him, blinking. Her lips parted, and a sob slipped through before she could stop it. "Mama," he repeated, more confidently now, as if testing the word and loving the sound of it. She clutched him tighter, whispering against his temple, "Yes, baby. Yes, I am." Outside the door, Graham watched, unmoving. A single tear slid down his cheek as he saw the two halves of his world finally come together in a single word. He waited until Elias drifted to sleep again, then joined Lucia by the crib. His hand found hers. "Sarah, I've been thinking about something," he murmured. "All these years, I've built companies, hosted parties, stood in rooms full of people who knew my name, but none of it ever felt like mine." Lucia looked at him. "I don't want to be that man anymore," he said. "I want to build something that matters, with you." Lucia squeezed his hand. "So do I." His lips curved into a tired, grateful smile. "Then let's start now." The next morning, the sun filtered softly through the nursery windows, casting golden rays over the antique rocking chair and Elias's crib. Lucia stood at the changing table, fastening the tiny buttons of Elias's shirt as he giggled and squirmed. Graham appeared in the doorway, holding something behind his back. Lucia turned. "You're up early." "I couldn't sleep," he said. "Too many thoughts, and one decision." She raised an eyebrow, curious. He stepped forward and revealed a small velvet box, tied with a white ribbon. Nestled inside wasn't a diamond, but something far more fitting. A pacifier attached to a delicate silk loop. Lucia's lips parted in surprise. "Is this?" He nodded. "It's not just a proposal. It's a promise. I'm not asking you to marry an estate or a legacy. I'm asking you to build a life with me from scratch, one honest day at a time." Lucia blinked back tears, her heart aching and blooming all at once. "That's the strangest ring I've ever seen." Graham chuckled. "I thought it was appropriate, given who introduced us." As if on cue, Elias clapped his hands. "Again! Again!" Lucia laughed, scooping him up. "We might need to get you a tux, little one." Graham stepped closer, wrapping an arm around both of them. "Whatever happens next, I want us to decide it together. No more secrets. No more silences." He replied. Lucia nodded. "Then you should know. I never stopped wondering if I deserved this. If I deserved you, or him." Graham tilted her chin up. "You were always worthy. You just spent too long letting the world tell you otherwise." They spent the afternoon in the garden, in the great garden loved beneath the wisteria vines. Graham spread out a blanket, and Elias toddled between their laps with his stuffed lion, giggling as butterflies drifted nearby. Lucia leaned against Graham's shoulder. "Do you think Charlotte would be proud?" He glanced upward. "I think she's the reason we found each other again." Lucia closed her eyes for a moment, letting the breeze kiss her cheeks. Later that evening, Graham lit candles in the dining room, not for show but for warmth. He served dinner himself, plating simple dishes with quiet care. Lucia watched him from across the table, the flickering light catching the curve of his smile. This wasn't the man she'd met in the hallway of a cold, silent mansion. This was someone softened by loss, strengthened by love. After dinner, Lucia placed Elias in his crib. He reached for her fingers, holding them tight even in sleep. She sang the lullaby once more, and this time, Graham sang with her. His voice low, a little off-key but full of heart. When they stepped into the hallway, Lucia turned to him. "Do you really want to leave the business behind?" "I want to raise a son who knows his father's heart more than his nameplate," Graham said. "And I want to be the man Charlotte trusted to raise him, with you." Lucia stepped into his arms. "Then yes." Graham pulled back slightly. "Yes, to the pacifier?" She grinned. "Yes to the life, yes to the love, yes to the family we've already become." He kissed her, sure, grounded. In the quiet of the night, while Elias slept beneath the stars painted on his ceiling, two people who had once lost everything found the only thing that ever truly mattered. Each other. The morning sun filtered through soft, white curtains as birdsong filled the once solemn estate. But it was no longer a place of silence and shadows. It was now called Elias House, a sanctuary for orphans, young mothers, and anyone who had nowhere else to go. Children's laughter echoed down the halls that were once cold and hollow. Murals of stars and lullabies adorned the nursery walls, and right in the foyer, where guests now entered with hope instead of hesitation, stood a bronze plaque that read, "In memory of Charlotte, in honor of Lucia." Leah stood beneath it that morning, brushing a hand gently over her name. Her long white dress shimmered faintly in the light, though it trailed through the garden's soil beneath her bare feet. A tradition she hadn't forgotten. One she'd once believed belonged to another lifetime. Elias ran down the pathway, wearing a tiny suit with muddy knees. He giggled as he held out a pillow with 2 simple gold rings tied to it. "Come on," he called, waving to Graham, who stood at the other end of the garden beneath a flower-draped arbor. Lucia took a breath, her heart full, and began her slow walk down the aisle. The staff gathered under the blooming apple trees. Children from the shelter lined the chairs with paper flower crowns. The cook wiped her tears with her apron. Even the gardener, who never smiled, tipped his. Lucia walked alone, but she wasn't alone. Elias walked beside her, proudly holding her hand, beaming with the joy of a boy who had found a real home. When she reached Graham, his eyes never left hers. He didn't reach for her immediately. He waited, letting her choose. She did. They held hands, their fingers laced not just with love, but with years of silence, struggle, and survival. The officiant's words were simple. No grand speeches, no long recitations. Just, "Do you, Graham Thorne, choose this woman not for her name or her past, but for her heart, her courage, and the way she holds the people you love?" "I do," Graham said, voice rough but sure. "Best Urias," the officiant continued. "Do you take this man, not for his fortune or his legacy, but for the man who chose truth over pride and love over power?" Lucia glanced down at Elias, who gave her a thumbs up with sticky fingers, and then looked back at Graham. The rings were exchanged in quiet reverence. No music played, only the soft rustle of wind through leaves and a chorus of tiny claps from the youngest children nearby. Lucia signed the license on a stone pedestal under the trees. Lucia Reyes Thorne, a name born from fire, storm, and love. That evening, laughter bubbled from the kitchen, where Graham wore an apron that didn't fit and attempted to frost cupcakes while children climbed on benches. Lucia taught one of the new girls how to braid a baby's hair. The once stern butler was playing peekaboo behind a curtain with a toddler. And in the hallway, a young maid stood frozen. Her hands trembled as she heard a baby cry from the nursery. She looked around nervously, unsure if it was her place to go in. Lucia appeared, her presence calm and grounding. She placed a gentle hand on the maid's shoulder. "You hear them cry," she said softly. "You hold them, always." The maid nodded, moved by the words and the weight they carried. Later that night, the garden sparkled under strings of soft lights, and Elias chased fireflies with a jar in one hand and a chocolate-smeared face. Graham stood at the edge of the nursery window, watching Lucia read to a little girl tucked under a knitted blanket. He leaned on the frame, a quiet smile on his face. For the first time in years, his heart didn't feel like a prison of grief. It felt like a home. Lucia gently closed the storybook and kissed the child's forehead before tiptoeing to the door. "She's having trouble sleeping," she whispered to Graham, "but I told her, the stars here are kinder." He reached for her hand. "That's because you're here." They walked side by side down the hallway, past photographs of Elias's first birthday cake, Lucia planting the first garden bed, and Graham holding a hammer awkwardly during the kitchen renovation. Moments captured not to boast, but to remember. When they reached the study, Lucia noticed something new. On the mantel above the fireplace stood a frame, simple, wooden, hand-carved. Inside it, a photo of Charlotte holding baby Elias and a younger Lucia standing nearby, half turned toward them, caught mid-laugh. Graham followed her gaze. "He would have been proud of you," he said quietly, of how you never stopped protecting him. Lucia blinked back tears. She gave me the first place I ever belonged. Toward now, Graham said, you've given that to others. The fire crackled gently in the background, and in the silence that followed, no words were needed. I'd Susie. Outside, Elias burst into the room carrying a handful of wildflowers. Mama, I found more purple ones, he said proudly, handing them to her. Lucia gathered them carefully, her fingers brushing the petals as if they were sacred. Let's dry these, she said, so we can press them in a book. Like the one you made with Charlotte? Elias asked. She said, voice soft. Exactly like that. In the final scene, morning light streams into the kitchen. Lucia stands barefoot at the stove, flipping pancakes with a sleepy smile. Graham sits on a stool with Elias in his lap, playing a soft tune on a guitar. Just a few chords, but enough to fill the room with warmth. Elias leans back against him and whispers, can we go visit Charlotte's house someday? Lucia turns, plate in hand, and answers gently, we'll go back, baby, one day. Elias hesitates. Did we ever really leave? She smiled, her eyes warm and far away. No, we just took the long way home. As the camera drifts back through the house, past the nursery, the photos, the garden blooming in early spring, a voice rises like a quiet lullaby, echoing in the stillness. Family isn't blood, it's the hands that held you when no one else did. The lights dim slowly as the screen fades to black, leaving only the sound of laughter, footsteps on wood, and the final flicker of a candle burning beside a nameplate that reads, Tia Reyes Thorne. Caretaker, mother, legacy,